Hello, so in this video on the anniversary of the execution of Charles I, I thought I'd talk about this question. Did Charles I deserve to die? Um, was it because of his actions? Was it his fault? Or was he a victim of Parliament taking it too far and Parliament really trying to kind of push their power more than they should have? So before we get into the kind of prosecution and defense and then something of a judgment, I'm going to go into just briefly into the events of the reign of Charles I, very, very briefly. I've done other videos on this period that you can look at if you want more detail. But here are the brief details. So Charles I was crowned in 1625. He has a personal rule, 1629 to 40, where he dissolves Parliament and rules on his own, and he has to find different ways of raising money without Parliament. He imposes kind of like these medieval taxes on the country that aren't very popular. He imposes a new religious settlement, which a lot of people, particularly Puritans, feel is too similar to Catholicism. It's very, very unpopular. He tries to impose a new religious settlement in Scotland, which there's a significant backlash and a war, and he loses that war, he loses money, so he's forced to call Parliament again in 1640. Parliament really wants to kind of get their own back, and between 1640 and 42, they arrest his key advisors, they imprison them, impeach them, and they execute the main advisor, Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford. This leads to the outbreak of the Civil War, or Civil Wars, I should say. The First Civil War, 1642 to 46, and the Second Civil War, 48 to 49. Parliament are ultimately successful in these wars. And throughout these wars and in this period, Parliament do offer Charles settlements, negotiations. They're trying to make a deal with him just to kind of reduce his power slightly, or just to impose some of their kind of ideas on him. And really, with if we look at these, they do get more kind of sympathetic as time goes on. That Charles could have negotiated and could have come away from this, with his head held high. I think it wasn't that these weren't too punitive, and actually they are. There are times when we look back in hindsight, we think Charles perhaps could have negotiated here. Anyway, he doesn't negotiate. He doesn't take any of these deals, and by the end of 1648, it's clear there isn't going to be an agreement, and so there's basically a coup, an army coup called Pride's Purge in December 1648, where Colonel Thomas Pride goes outside Parliament with the army and removes moderate MPs, any MPs who are willing to kind of continue negotiations with the king, and arrests another group of MPs, which leaves a rump of 240 MPs in the House of Commons. And they are the MPs that are involved in the trial and execution of Charles I in 1649. And even then, fewer than 240 take part in the trial, and fewer than that sign the death warrant. So it really is a small group of MPs who are involved in this event. But that's a very, very quick run through of the reign of Charles I. So in terms of the prosecution, did Charles I deserve to die? Here are some arguments. So you could argue he behaved in a way that antagonised Parliament. As I said before, personal rule, imposition of ship money. So there's like a tax around the country that people weren't used to paying, and promotion of Arminianism. As I said, this is a new church settlement, a new religious settlement that lots of people, particularly Puritans, thought of as too similar to Catholicism. He also had married Catholic Henrietta Maria, and this belief in kind of divine right of kings. He wasn't very good at kind of listening, negotiating, conceding anything. Next point, he refused to negotiate. As I said, he rejects various attempts at political settlement, even though some of these actually are not vastly different to what was going on before. It's things like Parliament would have control of the army or could appoint advisors, but he shuts those down. He isn't really interested. He delays any response. And then in 1647, he makes a secret agreement with Scots behind the back of Parliament, which you could argue proves that he couldn't be trusted, that even if Parliament had kind of not executed him, he would have got his own back, that he would have gone behind their backs and maybe killed parliamentary leaders or something like that. And even in 1649, when he was on trial, there were times where he was asked to accept and recognise the legitimacy of the trial, and he refused to do so. And some historians, and we'll see in a second some quotes from historians, have argued that even at that point, he could have potentially got out of being executed. He could have recognised the legitimacy of the trial, and there could have been some sort of settlement. And that didn't happen. So they're the arguments, or some of the arguments, in favour of the execution, that it had to be done. Okay, what have historians said? So I'm going to read through these quotes. I think they're good, and I think it's really useful in terms of this kind of historiographical debate. So John Morrill, really he's talking about the civil wars, but he says, it can thus be argued that the civil wars grew out of the policies and out of the particular failings of a particular king, Charles I. So really pinning it on Charles I. It's Charles I's fault that the war broke out, and therefore we can kind of extend that and say, well, if it's his fault for the war, then the war is the cause of the execution, and we could expand that out. Leander de Lisle says, in refusing to accept the jurisdiction of the court, so we're talking about January 1649 here, Charles had denied that the Commons was the superior power in the kingdom. The cost of keeping the king alive, accepting the king's superiority over them, was now greater than that of his death. He had left them with no choice but to cut off his head. So at that point, he could have said, okay, I accept that the Commons has power, and there could have been a settlement, and he didn't. He refused to do that, and therefore they had to kill him. That's what Leander de Lisle is arguing. Graham Goodlad, in an article talking about these kind of issues, says his contribution to the tragedy of his reign cannot be denied. His personality encouraged conflict. He proved unable to make the imaginative leap required to establish a workable settlement with his opponents. So he didn't have the kind of imagination. He didn't have the ability to negotiate. Okay, so that's the prosecution. So have a think. Do you agree with this? Do you think it was Charles I's fault? Now we're on to the defence. So these are some arguments that you could argue, say, actually it wasn't his fault, that he shouldn't have been killed. And the first point is that he acted as any monarch would. You know, that if you think about the religious issues of the time, this was going on all over Europe. The 30 Years' War was being fought. It wasn't solely in England, or England, Scotland, and Ireland. It was across Europe that these religious divides were happening. Financial issues were similarly beyond his control. When he came to the throne in 1625, there was an empty treasury because of war. And he did his best to try and minimize that, and actually the Treaty of Madrid, for example, in 1630, making peace with Spain, and he signed a treaty with France the year before, which saved money. So he did his best, you could argue. Those things were beyond his control. Similarly, criticisms about his belief in divine right, you could say that's common and expected of the time. You know, Charles II, James I, Louis XIV, all of these monarchs believed in divine right. It's not just Charles I. Some historians have argued that he was attempting to modernise and reform the church and state by, for example, standardising religious practice. And his opponents were the ones who were kind of backward looking and didn't want change, that he was trying to modernise things. And finally, and I think this is a crucial point, is that his execution was carried out by a very small majority of MPs and members of the army without significant public support. So, I think even if you think Charles I was terrible, I don't think you can argue that his execution had support of the vast majority of the public. I just don't think that was the case. That there is records of people who are involved in the trial of the king, receiving like public damnation after the execution. And if we think about the way that Charles I is remembered as a martyr, I think that explains that there wasn't kind of vast public support. Really, it was a very small minority of MPs and members of the army who pushed this through. So what have historians had to say? The main historian I'm going to talk about here, or the one I'm going to talk about in terms of the defense, is Mark Kiszlansky. And I think this is a really, really great quote. Kiszlansky says, "Beneath the reviled and excoriated king of historical reputation is a flesh and blood man, trapped by circumstances he could not control and events he did not shape. So basically saying it's not Charles I's fault. It was out of his control. He shouldn't be blamed for these events, and therefore he shouldn't have been. We can extend that and say he shouldn't have been executed. It wasn't his fault. Okay, now on to a judgment. What do we think? So, could he have negotiated in that period of 1646, 47, 48, 49? Could he have negotiated with Parliament? I personally believe he probably could have, and he did have something in his nature, his stubborn nature, that meant that he didn't negotiate. He could have potentially negotiated. However, a big caveat that I would absolutely accept is that it's easy in hindsight, isn't it, to think, oh, he should have negotiated there. At the time, he didn't know what Parliament was going to do next. He perhaps thought that he could get out of it. He could persuade Parliament or play Parliament and the Scots off against each other and come out with some sort of victory. The next part of this is, did Parliament and the army go too far? You know, as I said before, it's very difficult, I think it'd be impossible to say that this was the will of the people, the majority of the people. I think even though there'd been a civil war and the country had been absolutely divided, I don't think the majority of people, you know, and all the things I've read on this, there's nowhere it says, yeah, the majority of people wanted to kill the king. I don't think that was the case. And where I kind of maybe stand on this is this idea that it could be both. It could be the fault of the king, but it can also be the fault of his opponents. That it's not, we can't just say, yes, it was his fault, or yes, it was Parliament's fault. That maybe, you know, both of these things work together, that he made the situation worse and Parliament and the army went too far. So they both led to this event happening, led to the king being executed. And there's a quote here from Anthony Fletcher, which I think is really good. And he's talking about the outbreak of the Civil War, but I think we can extend this to talk about the execution of the king. And I think it's a really fascinating quote. It says, "Two groups of men became prisoners of opposing myths that fed on one another, so that events seemed to confirm two opposing interpretations of the political crisis that were both originally misconceived and erroneous." So what I think Fletcher is arguing here is that both Charles and his opponents believed in this kind of like this myth of what they thought the other one was doing. So Charles thought his opponents wanted to get rid of the monarchy from the get-go, which Parliament didn't want to get rid of the monarchy from the get-go. They wanted just to maybe reduce the some of the things that Charles had been doing in terms of religious settlement, financial policies, you know, some advisors, those kind of things. And Parliament believed that the king wanted to be absolutist and not work with Parliament at all. And so they both ended up believing these kind of myths, and it led them down this path to the execution of the king, which was unnecessary. And I think that's a really, really good quote. I'd be really, really interested to hear what people have to say about this. So please leave a comment. Do you think that Charles I did deserve to die? Do you think that his actions justified that act? Or do you think that this wasn't justified, that Parliament and the army went too far, that the king's opponents went too far? Thank you for listening.